Good evening. Thank you all for being here. My name is Christy Abbott, the Hampton Roads Director for Chesapeake Bay Foundation. Thanks for taking your evening. It's a beautiful night to be here and making the trek up to Brock Environmental Center. Tonight, we're here in the second in the climate series, Climate Impacts in Hampton Roads, Adapting with a Nature-Based Approach. And you have three experts that are on the ground working on these issues and have for years. So you're really hearing from the best. We're going to have plenty of time for question and answer. We will save question and answer till the end, but there's a Mentimeter. You'll see a QR code, another QR code in a moment. Feel free to scan that at any point in the presentation and ask your question. And after all three speakers, we'll have plenty of time for question and answers. I want to thank our sponsors, Planetary and CMA CGM, for sponsoring the series. Really appreciate that support. And just a reminder that tonight's program is being recorded and it's on Facebook Live as well. With that, I think we'll go ahead and get started. It's my pleasure to introduce the speakers tonight. We're deeply grateful for their time to be here. I'm going to keep the introductions short, and I'll introduce each speaker before they start, just because I know you all want to hear the content and have plenty of time for the actual presentations and questions and answers. So first, I'd like to call up Jessica Whitehead as our first speaker. We're honored to have her with us tonight. She is the Joan P. Endowed Executive Director for the Institute of Coastal Adaptation and Resilience, or ICAR, at Old Dominion University. Dr. Whitehead earned her PhD in Geography and a Master's of Science in Meteorology from Penn State University and a BS in Physics with a concentration in Meteorology from the College of Charleston. Before joining ODU, she was the first Chief Resilience Officer for North Carolina Office of Recovery and Resiliency. She'll provide valuable perspectives on how our community is experiencing and addressing coastal adaptation and resilience in Virginia.
All right, thank you so much, Christy. I am getting my timer out because Christy asked me 3 times if I was really sure I could do this in 10 minutes. So the answer had better be yes, or she's going to be angry at me. All right. I believe I am your scientist nerd queue up so that Joe and Justin can come up and talk about all of the great things that are getting done, but I get to set the table a little bit. There we go. I first want to bring you to the U.S. National Climate Assessment as a little bit of table setting. How many people here have heard of the U.S. National Climate Assessment? Oh, good, almost half. All right, so the U.S. National Climate Assessment is mandated by the Global Change Research Act of 1990 and is an all-volunteer effort every 4 years to assess the science, the impacts, and the state of responses on climate change throughout the United States. It's required by Congress, has to get done. So the last U.S. National Climate Assessment came out in November of 2023. And I really kind of wanted to bring a couple of just really useful graphics here that are relevant to our region here in Hampton Roads. So I wanted to start with coastal flood because I know everybody here is really, really familiar with coastal flood. And talk about some of the different factors that we have and the number of different places that the water that you happen to be driving through, please don't actually drive through that water, but theoretically the water that you could be driving through is coming from. So we have sea level rise, we have variability in ocean currents, we have tides, and we have land sinking, we have groundwater tables rising, and on top of that, we have storms and storm surge and rainfall. So these are all impacts of climate change that we are very, very familiar with here in Hampton Roads. So the Southeast chapter of the U.S. National Climate Assessment, which was actually led by Jeremy Hoffman, who is from Richmond. He is, at the time, he was with the Science Museum of Virginia. He's now with Groundwork USA, and he is an adjunct at University of Richmond. So Virginia lead here on this one takes a look at some of the key messages here that are a little bit broader than coastal flood. And I wanted to bring those up today because as we're talking about natural and nature-based features, the water's not the only factor. It's also heat, it's also drought, it's also all of these other things that help us know whether or not plants are going to be healthy. So regional growth is something that is combining with climate change to increase risks throughout the Southeast. It's worsening human health and the disparities of impacts in that in people's health. It is disproportionately damaging our jobs, our households, and our economic security. And in particular, the chapter calls out agriculture as facing very important threats, but also an opportunity for innovation throughout the Southeast. So lots of stuff there, most of it bad, some of it better. Innovation is good. The idea that there are different ways that we can adapt to and solve some of these problems. The Southeast chapter runs all the way up through Virginia, but in a quirk of how the federal government divides up the regions in the chapters, you will notice that the Southeast stops at Virginia. And for us, it's also really important to think about the Chesapeake Bay. The Chesapeake Bay comes in the Northeast chapter. So the key messages from the Northeast chapter, which I led, is that chronic impacts of extreme weather and rainfall are shaping both mitigation and adaptation strategies throughout the Northeast. And this goes for Hampton Roads too. Not just mitigation, the efforts to reduce the harmful effects of greenhouse gas pollution, but actions and adaptations that we are taking to either reduce risks or to take advantage of opportunities. Specifically, the Northeast chapter spends a bit of time on coastal and ocean impacts as really driving adaptation to climate change throughout the Northeast. This is partly because there's always an agreement in the National Climate Assessment that the Chesapeake Bay gets addressed in the Northeast, otherwise it gets split. So marine heat waves, changing habitats due to sea level rise and changing storm regimes, shifting species, these are all things that we are documenting. And I should say that when something gets included in the U.S. National Climate Assessment, it has to pass certain Federal Information Quality Act standards. So I just can't go out there and say, oh, I think fish are moving out of the Lynn Haven River and publish it in the National Climate Assessment. It has to be peer-reviewed literature. It can sometimes be very well rigorously researched nonprofit document, but that has to go through review. It can be state or local documents. It can be indigenous knowledge. But primarily, we're looking at things that are in the peer-reviewed literature. It is not going out and pulling stuff out of Bob's blog and putting it in the National Climate Assessment. It really has to pass that rigor test. Similar in the Southeast, we also talk about disproportionate impact throughout the Northeast of climate change and how those impacts on the most affected people are driving the policy choices that we make. The good news is that climate action plans are being implemented. And if I was giving you a Northeast talk, I would actually give you we did an entire analysis of showing which states have varying statewide climate assessments, just impact assessments and adaptation plans that are in place or in progress. So it's something that is becoming very, very widespread. And lastly, the implementation of climate plans depends on financing. So all of this stuff is really great. You've got to have money to be able to do it. So how do you get that money? How do you get that action? How do you get people on board for wanting to do this? How do you make nature-based solutions happen that our next speakers are going to talk about? Well, one of the carrots is taking a look at the carbon emission potential of these nature-based features and nature-based solutions. As we're looking through, particularly at some, and I'm old, so I have to come back over here and take a look at where we have the wetlands here. You know, a lot of these carbon sequestration benefits are up here in reforestation and trees, but we see significant mitigation potential also in restoring tidal and inland wetlands and avoiding seagrass loss and seagrass restoration. We also have sticks. Avoiding damage is really important. This is even more important as we see the federal posture on how federal funds are going to flow or whether they will continue to flow for certain purposes like disaster recovery makes this even more important. As we look at the negative impacts of climate change, those damages lead to infrastructure costs. They lead to needs to pay for disaster relief, which may no longer be coming as quickly or in the same way as from the federal government. Increased healthcare utilization. If you are living in a house that is moldy, then you're going to be seeking more healthcare for problems that are associated with that. And higher insurance costs. We also see impacts to tax base. As these places are more and more affected, we begin to see real estate values affected, household income is affected, and also business revenues affected as you're continuing to have to repair damage. So that leads to a net negative impact on your public budget. So the do nothing option is not exactly the free option either. So what kind of programs, policies build resilience? They're not all nature-based, but although that's the focus of the talk today, but I at least wanted to throw up some of the examples here to show you that not everything is a project that you can go out and stand on or go out and take a picture of. Some of these things are really important, like social and community networks in times of disaster, making sure that you know who your neighbors are and how you're able to help them. Economic approaches like improving business continuity or diversifying economies so that if one industry takes a big hit, there are other industries to keep the region afloat economically. So, and then of course there are things that are infrastructure or housing or nature-based solutions, but there's a broad range of things that you can do. So I wanted to introduce ecosystem-based adaptation. And the idea here is a type of nature-based solution that we see very frequently here. And this is another national climate assessment doing a lot of looking at restoring floodplains, being able to restore coastal wetlands. Some of these, as you're looking at it, you'll say, oh, that's not necessarily going to stop a 15-foot surge. Not everything has that role. Doesn't mean that that doesn't have value as a part of the project. It can support biodiversity. It can improve water quality. It can sequester carbon, oyster restoration. Specifically, this is a nice continuum, and I think Joe and I grabbed the same one. This idea that we have completely natural landscapes, but then we have a continuum here of nature-based solutions, all the way from purely gray projects to these hybrid projects where we have basically green components added to gray to provide that additional protection. And lastly, because I'm running out of time, I wanted to highlight again from the National Climate Assessment that one of the examples, actually the example from the coastal chapter of the last U.S. National Climate Assessment was of the Chesterfield Heights project in Norfolk. So this project was really held up by the authors of that particular chapter as an example of how to do transformative neighborhood scale adaptation. And it's right here. You can go walk right through it. I am sure Justin would be more than happy to give you a tour if you want to go see it. It's really cool. I'm going to skip over and just put in kind of a quick plug for what we do and the role of universities in this space. As the Institute for Coastal Adaptation and Resilience is really focused on advancing the practice of resilience. So yes, we do some, as a university, you'd expect there to need to be some fundamental science, but we're really looking for those opportunities to do science to action. And the role that a university can bring in to facilitate complex projects or to assist with innovation, testing out ideas, and also just the idea of what kind of analysis do you have to do for policies to make sure that these new solutions can be enacted. Those are the kinds of things that all of our faculty affiliates are interested in, and really do a whole lot of work in partnership with cities, with nonprofits, with the private sector in particular, to really be a catalyst for resilience in what is really a robust resilience ecosystem in the Hampton Roads region. And very specifically, just to that private sector point, I wanted to put a plug in for one of our projects. This was funded by a Go Virginia grant that is the Coastal Virginia Adaptation and Resilience Consortium. And this focuses on helping, it started out as the architecture and engineering industries, but getting these companies information and connections and being ready to bid on projects. So as an information sharing hub that's available for these companies. Carol Considine, who's our deputy director, leads this particular project in cooperation with a whole bunch of other partners. And it's really, really cool to see the number of companies now who are coming into this space. And I find that to be something that's particularly hopeful in these days. So with that, I'm going to leave you my contact information and turn the floor over to, I think Joe is next.
Thank you, Jessica. Excellent overview and baseline. We will get these slide decks out to you. We're going to send an evaluation tomorrow morning, something like that, and we'll get the slide decks as a PDF if that's okay with the presenters. So if you're taking pictures or you want to get all the details down, have no fear. Also, too, on the front of your program, on the bottom, is the same QR code for questions and answers, so please feel free to scan that and let me know if you have any trouble with that. With that, we'll call Joe Rieger up. Joe's still here, that's a good sign. Next, we have Joe Rieger, Installation Resilience Program Manager for the U.S. Navy. Joe received his master's degree in aquatic ecology from Old Dominion University in 2002. Before joining the Navy, he worked for 22 years at the Elizabeth River Project in Norfolk. He managed the organization's restoration programs, including a pivotal role in numerous environmental projects, including the nation's first sediment remediation project led by nonprofit and restoration of oyster habitats in the Lafayette River. Joe will discuss the Navy effort to enhance resilience and adapt to climate impacts.
Thanks, Christy. Good evening. How's everyone? Good? Well, I appreciate the opportunity to come in and talk with you today about the Navy's efforts for resiliency. I was talking to my colleague, Kevin DuBois, who's here, that it's not often we get to talk to the general public about the work that the Navy's doing. And we are doing a lot. And I wanted to cover some of that effort here tonight. And just so you know, this is just a small amount of work that actually the Navy's doing. There's other departments that are doing significant amounts in energy savings and other work also. So to start out with, I am the Mid-Atlantic Environmental Resilience Program Manager. And so with this, this is a brand new role that rolled out this past year, about a year and a half ago. And this was funding that came through to meet a goal of the Navy reducing carbon. And so the idea here is that these managers would work within their region, and here for me it's the Mid-Atlantic, and develop projects that we could put on the ground to offset carbon inputs. And so I'm kind of the one-man show that goes around to some of the installations. We think of projects, and then there's a funding pot that we can apply for. It's about $60 million internal for the entire U.S. And then based off of mission conditions and also the particular project for reducing carbon, there's a decision which projects are actually chosen. And so, so far, this is a busy slide, and I hated it, but I couldn't find a better one. So this is kind of my area that I work in here. So all these states are areas that are considered the Mid-Atlantic for NAVFAC. And the current projects that have been funded in 2023 and 24 are highlighted. So you can see that there's projects all the way over to the Great Lakes that are being funded, all the way up to Maine and down the eastern seaboard. And I'm going to cover a few of these, but in general, the one thing that I think was important is that this all came about because of this Climate Action 2030. You can still find this on the internet right now, so if you're interested, you can go and look at some of the goals that the Navy has set. And the department set a goal of driving down carbon by 5 million metric tons of CO2 by 2027. So very ambitious goal. We were one of the only DoD groups to actually come up with a measurable reduction. And the funding that I mentioned was one way at getting at this number and trying to reduce our carbon footprint. And then the main focus of all this work was to use the nature-based solutions that were just mentioned. And so when you look at, here's this continuum that was just shown. And I think the key thing here is to look at, not long ago, I would say this side of the spectrum was the norm, right? So, oh, things are flooding, what do we do? Let's build a seawall. So this was kind of the norm, even tidal wetlands. When homeowners wanted to protect their property, that was the norm. But over the last 20 to 30 years, we've been moving more to this side of the spectrum. And I think that one thing that we have noticed is that you cannot do just gray, you can't do just the green. These hybrid approaches really are kind of the perfect niche for a lot of the areas that we want to work in. And some of these areas are ones that have higher or more dynamic, so they have larger fetches where you're going to have areas that are going to get eroded away more significantly. So incorporating some rock materials in with these these green structures are very important. And, this is a paper that just was published in February. And so they looked at the perception and limitations of nature-based solutions. And so you can see that 69% agreed that there is a limit to where you can use these. And I think it's important because, if you put the wrong solution in a highly dynamic system, it will fail. And we don't want to have continuous failures in this arena, because then people will start not wanting to implement these types of solutions. So it's really important that we know that when we decide which of these we want to put in, the dynamic, how dynamic it is, and also what the likelihood of survivorship is going to look like. So this is a busy slide, and all I just wanted to just show you is that kind of the amount of money that the Navy invested in just the Mid-Atlantic, and this is in 2023 and 2024. This is when they had no one kind of in the region. You had one person, really, Kevin Du Bois, who was doing helping to carry out some of this. And one of the things that his group came up with was a carbon calculator. So if you're going to do all these projects, you should be able to count the carbon that you're actually saving to try to get to that goal. So he developed a calculator, and then on top of that, a lot of these other on-the-ground projects were moving forward. And over here, this just shows you in general where a lot of these projects were. Then one big project that came out of this was a project on the York River called Penniman Spit. This is Penniman Spit. Where is it? Right here. So as you can see, it was a spit that came out in the York River. It had actually broken through, and a tremendous amount of wave action comes up Kings Creek, and a lot of times what you can see the sediment movement because of all the dynamic wind-driven flooding that was happening here. So what they came up with was to rebuild this and add some stone in front of it to protect it. And the reason they decided to do this is there is a Superfund site in this creek and off of this creek, and also they were having significant erosion and loss of land along the Yorktown area. And so this shows you back in 1937, it was 14 acres, and then by 2019, we were down to 4.6 at low water, and at high water, 1.7. So, it lost a tremendous 10 acres of loss over that time. And so they came up with a design, and this is this hybrid approach that we just mentioned, where you're going to have a rock sill here. So this is your kind of gray feature offshore to cut down the amount of wave action. And then you have your green solution behind it, which is your high and low marsh. And in this situation, they actually built the site higher. So you're right here, you're building this marsh for increased water levels into the future with a greater amount of high marsh versus low marsh here, and then larger sill structures that are higher. So as water levels rise into the future, that this will be able to adapt. So this is just some construction where you can see, the machines and how they were putting in a lot of this sill structure, and then they planted out this project. It took a lot of funding streams to put this together, and I think a lot of those in nonprofits know that you have to put together multiple funding streams in order to get these projects done. So overall, $4.2 million project, and here are all the funders that contributed to this project. A second example, so more dynamic system. This is a Navy installation along the coast of Virginia. I can't really tell you where it's at, but that's what I was told. But you could probably figure it out. This site had significant storm erosion. They actually had a man-made dune. So this is an armored dune, which you probably don't know about, but they basically put these rocks underneath the dune, so when it washed away, it would stop the ongoing erosion. But usually there would be a dune all the way out to here. So this is some of the damage that had occurred after a number of storms. And so the installation actively started, there's the armor, started working with the National Aquarium and volunteers, where they would collect Christmas trees, put them into the dunes to collect the sand in the wintertime, build these sand fences, replant areas that were barren, and then on top of it, they were also eradicating an invasive plant that was growing and taking over the dune. So because of this, we started seeing sand accrual. So we started seeing larger dunes, taller dunes, and this is that same location a year later, where you can see the amount of sand accumulation occurring because of these were the Christmas trees that they had put in here to actually collect sand at the base of these projects. So 2025, so started out great. We actually got 17 projects funded. It was almost $8 million. Thought, hey, look, we have a lot to do. I was managing all this. And then we ended up getting significant cuts in our budget. So now we're down to 7 key projects and getting ready to push out 3 big ones, hopefully here in the next 2 weeks. And so really, this got all messed up. So we had that 3.6, and we had 8 million. So now we were back down to right around 4 million. So we got half of our budget cut for doing these projects. But the one I just wanted to highlight, because I think it's unique, it's not here in Chesapeake Bay, is this Cutler project right here. It's the largest project that we're working on. So this Cutler radar base is in Maine. It is pretty much the furthest you can go before you go to Canada, last town out there. It's this radar base that sits on a peninsula. Basically, it's used to talk to warships. So it's extremely important. It can reach all the way to the Mediterranean. The idea of this is that in this interface between the land and the sea, there are cables that go out that then send out these electrical signals that then we can pick up on ships. Well, this right here was the access road, where you have to access these to maintain. That's where the land part and the ocean part meet each other. They're copper wires in there. So if they break, you come back in and weld it. So this road leads to these, and if you can't get to them, then you can't get the welding equipment out there, and thus you cannot talk to your ships. So this was basically a year later. You can see the amount of erosion. The road is now gone. This little access panel is now here. So this funding is to rebuild this road and to do a rocky shore restoration project to provide more armoring and habitat to this site. And so right now we have $2.8 million in the budget to do just the design because it's so complicated. But we're hoping that we'll have that awarded by the end of this fiscal year. And again, it's a project to me that I think, we can debate about the word sea level rise, but here we know that for the Navy at least, this is a mission issue, and it is installation resiliency if you can't talk to the ships from the land. So we're hoping that we'll get funding to actually implement that in the next year or so. So last thing, engineering with nature. So this is a Corps of Engineers program that is run nationwide. And you can see they've worked with, they basically do nature-based suggestions for different bases around the US, and here are all the ones that they've worked with previous. The nice thing is that they will be coming to Hampton Roads and giving recommendations to Naval Station Norfolk and to Yorktown, and then the following year to the rest of the installations in Hampton Roads. But this is what they do. They come in, they develop conceptual ideas and turn these into ideas on paper that you can try to get buy-in from leadership to help make these installations more resilient. And so they're also doing trainings for all the staff. All the staff are invited, the environmental staff, so that when we have planners making decisions about, where should we place this building, that they don't place it right where you don't want it because of impacts due to rising seas. Or if they need to look at nature-based solutions, they're thinking about it during the design and not after, and trying to retrofit into the landscape. So we'll have 9 of these trainings that are ongoing until next year. And it's actually been very helpful. The last one was just on dunes. The one before that was on some thin layer placement of sediments. And then there'll also be a living shoreline one that's coming up also. So with that, that's what the Navy, a bite of what the Navy is doing so far. Thank you.
I'm going to pull up our QR code for questions, just to give you all a chance to submit any while Justin's coming up. So thank you, Joe. I had no idea the Navy was doing so much. Really appreciate you taking the time to share that information, and I believe others feel the same way. Next, last but not least, we have Justin Shafer, Coastal Resilience Manager for the City of Norfolk. Justin Shafer is the Coastal Resilience Manager for the Office of Resilience for the City of Norfolk. He holds a Master's of Science degree from Old Dominion University. His academic background and professional experience have equipped him with the skills necessary to address the challenges the city is now facing. Before his current role, Mr. Shafer served as the environmental engineer and project manager for City of Norfolk, and prior to that, as an environmental scientist at Davis Environmental Consultants. His work focuses on developing and implementing strategies to enhance Norfolk's resilience to coastal hazards and climate change. Justin will share the city's initiatives and strategies for coastal resilience. There we go, sorry. You saw it backwards, my apologies.
Thank you, Chris. Evening, everybody. Always great to be here at Rock, joining you all tonight. So again, Justin Shafer with the City of Norfolk. The topic of the night is nature-based solutions, and this is something that the City of Norfolk has a long history with. Back many years, we've always taken a fair but firm approach to our regulatory programs, really working in a city like Norfolk that's so built out to maximize what we can do to maintain, conserve our riparian buffers, our beaches, and our wetlands. So taking strong approaches on that, as well as voluntary approaches like Tree City USA to restore our tree canopy. We've been a member of that for approaching 40 years now in the City of Norfolk. But I think what really Norfolk has worked really hard on and has been really helpful for our implementation efforts is the development of our community partnerships. And we've had long-standing efforts like Keep Norfolk Beautiful, where we get out and we have volunteers helping to clean up our open spaces, our shorelines. But more importantly are the relationships that we've started to build with nonprofit organizations like the Chesapeake Bay Foundation, Elizabeth River Project, Lovely Wetland Partnership, and others. And a lot of that was led through a few dedicated staff who were managing some of these programs, like Kevin Du Bois many years ago, who really saw the opportunity when these organizations came to the city to ask to work on public property, these little short sections of shoreline, these little coves, low depression areas, to support them, to help them with permitting, to help them with finding small grants that the city could assist with. And so that's led to great relationships that we've continued to build on. The city itself really got into the game of building larger nature-based solutions through some regulatory requirements on us through our stormwater program, the Chesapeake Bay TMDL, for instance, where the city had to start thinking creatively about how we were going to achieve these large requirements. And we wanted to make sure that we were doing it in a way where we weren't just meeting water quality goals, but that we were meeting other benefits as well. So we started taking a look at our old stormwater ponds that had been in place for 30 or 40 years, and how could we retrofit those, adding wetland benches around the edges, which helped with filtration, and then of course added aesthetics and more recreational value to those in our park spaces. Looking at our ditch systems that wind through Norfolk, how could we modify those, creating bioswales, taking low areas that crisscross throughout Norfolk and turning some of those into constructed wetlands. So again, we get both water management and filtration out of those areas while also adding wildlife habitat. And so of course, meeting those water quality cost effectiveness has to be the main driver in that sort of program. But we were also looking at ways to reduce flooding, to add the recreation and aesthetics value, and particularly to look at reducing loss of city property. And this is where living shorelines, for instance, became a big activity for the City of Norfolk. And I think we were one of the leaders in really pushing for this implementation through the Chesapeake Bay TMDL efforts, because we saw that we could get a lot of reductions to meet our goals while also stabilizing a shoreline with a road next to it, where we were going to eventually have to replace that road when it collapsed, and then also add wildlife value, add a little passive water access point where people could take kayaks in. So really just checking a lot of boxes, win, win, win. So you see an example here of a shoreline that at some point we had tried to stabilize and that clearly was no longer in good shape, and we were able to fix that up. At the same time, back around 2013, our last comprehensive plan was passed, and that really tried to push every department to be thinking about open space, tree canopy, wetland restoration. And so it became more cross-departmental beyond just public works and planning. We further broadened the scope of our efforts when we started to really dig deep into our resilience strategies. So in 2014, we passed a strategy, and it expanded beyond just thinking about stormwater to really dig into what are we going to have to do to meet the coastal resilience challenges of the future. And beyond that, not just looking at environmental risks like flooding or heat, but what are the social impacts of those? What are the economic impacts of those? What kind of stressors are going to come when we do have some sort of an event? And how can we work to build resilience ahead of that so that we can bounce back better and faster? Expanded on that in 2015 when we had a regional Dutch dialogues effort, where we really started to think at more of a neighborhood scale. So not just a little project here and a little project there, but we're an older city, we're going through redevelopment. How can we take large sections of the city and think about redeveloping them holistically so that we can meet all these goals? At the same time, working with the Army Corps on our coastal storm risk management project, where we're thinking about the perimeter of the city and what sort of defensive layers do we need to add there. And through both of these efforts, we were working through these hybrid approaches. So like we saw Jess and Joe show up on the screen, these approaches where it's not just a wall or a berm, but it's a wall or a berm with a wetland in front of it and trees behind it. So we're thinking of hybrid approaches. And then that's big, but we knew that, for rainfall, for instance, we also had to think what could each parcel do. So we advanced our Retain Your Rain program, where we really promoted businesses, schools, residents to do something on their property. So that might be adding a rain barrel, that might be planting a rain garden, but something. And every little parcel does that, it adds up. That's less water getting to the street where it can flood us. So kind of building out these different programs from different angles. These came together in a few other efforts. Around 2018, we adopted a green infrastructure plan for the city for the first time. And this plan looked at trees, looked at wetlands, looked at these other approaches like rain gardens, open space in general, and looked at where it was in the city currently, where it was going to be in the future as we continue to lose land due to sea level rise or to development, and where it might move around. So we know wetlands are migrating, and they're going to do that even in a city like Norfolk that's very built out. So we started to think about what sort of actions could we take to conserve and restore and better adapt. And the city was at the same time developing a new zoning ordinance that took some of those same ideas and implemented them as regulations on new and redevelopment, so that as a development occurred, they had to think about these principles of green infrastructure and retain your rain, so that they have to do something. And not every, a big apartment building is going to do more than a little small store, but it helps to, again, just add up and build these layers of resilience that we like to talk about. 2019, the city passed a climate action plan, which really started to look at things from more of a mitigation approach. So what could the city do, our small part for the bigger kind of global climate? There was a big movement amongst mayors around the country and around the world back then to commit to doing, something. And so this plan, it looked at energy efficiency of our buildings and of our fleet, but from a nature-based solution approach, it looked at things like reducing urban heat island by further expanding our tree canopy. And it's not just adding trees wherever you could, but really trying to force trees into development so that these really hot zones are dealt with, so we don't have these pockets of heat. And again, getting back to socioeconomic issues of issues like food, community agriculture. As you face these threats, the more little pockets of food you have around the city, the more options people who are at higher risk will have to access food during a hazard. So just trying to find ways to weave these into our programs and projects around the city. So I wanted to highlight a few projects in particular that really brought a lot of these concepts together. The first of them is the Ohio Creek project. And this one we're really proud of. It's gotten a lot of attention, and it's been brought up, Jess already brought up. I'm always happy to have tours out there if anybody ever wants to see it. But this project started off actually as a Virginia Sea Grant funded effort through Wetlands Watch, working with students from ODU and Hampton University, some of the early work that Jess mentioned by so they went around, they talked to the residents in this community of Chesterfield Heights and the adjacent community of Grandy Village. They talked to them about their flooding issues. When does it flood? Why do the residents see flooding as an issue when it occurs? And talked to them about the types of solutions they may like to see in their neighborhood. And we got a lot of good feedback. We then fleshed that out a bit more when we ran those Dutch dialogues a few years later. And with all of that information in mind, we were able to submit and successfully receive a $120 million Housing and Urban Development Natural Disaster Resiliency Competition grant that really let us take those ideas and push them forward here at this neighborhood scale that we have been thinking about trying to implement. And the whole idea here was to develop what we like to talk about as the coastal community of the future. And that's not going to be the same in any given neighborhood or any given city, but we wanted to try out a lot of different strategies so that we could see what worked well, what didn't over time. And we were very successful in this, we feel. We were able to implement a large earthen levee along the front of the neighborhood that provided protection up to about elevation 11, which even back then, that's now around the level that we're designing for coastal storm risk management before you take wave action into account. So a good level of protection for the eastern branch. In front of that, though, then we built a living shoreline with oyster reef. So again, pairing green and gray strategies. Berms woven through the backside of the neighborhood with wetland restoration in front of them, be it mitigation or restoration. We built out the entire drainage system, was redesigned and reconstructed. And instead of just putting pavement and curb back in, we put pervious pavement on 3 or 4 of the blocks. We put in around 30 bioswales woven through the neighborhood so that we got that filtration before it entered those new pipes and got down to the big pump stations that would pump it out into the river. There was an old creek that we were able to daylight. So we opened up a portion of an old creek that had been filled, turned it into a floodable park space so the children in the neighborhood had more recreational area. But at the same time, when it was raining, we had better flood storage. So really just taking these different concepts we had been talking about for a while and pushing them forward. Just some images of the project here. You can see the shoreline's doing well now. This is the bottom left there, or bottom, yeah, left for you guys, is the stormwater park. And that's pretty soon after construction, but much more green out there now. The berms along the park and along the shoreline have nice wildflowers a lot of times of the year. The bioswales haven't always worked out as well as we might hope, but we have continued to maintain them. We've recently planted some small little shrubs in there. We think the more formal approach might go better with the residents. So continuing to adaptively manage these features as time goes by. So the second project I wanted to highlight was the St. Paul's Blue Greenway, which is currently under design. And so this project was built again out of the Dutch dialogues with this understanding that we've been mapping the historic creeks in the city for a long time. A lot of Norfolk was literally water, and most of the rest of it was wetlands. You go back 400 or 500 years, and so that was filled. Right about here is Harbor Park, so that was out in open water back then. So a lot of fill there, and so this area of St. Paul's in particular so often faces flooding. You can see all the little red dots are where we get flooding complaints. So we know that we flood where we used to fill. So we know that we have to think not just about the perimeter of the city, but also the internal area, and opens up more options for nature-based solutions. So what we envision with this is really a gem of a park that is a giant green space in the middle of what is now a pretty concrete downtown Norfolk, that's going to add not just recreational amenities around this new community in the St. Paul's area that we're building, the Kindred community, but it's going to add flood storage. We call this daylighting of these creeks. It's going to provide flood storage in this former Newton Creek watershed, with a 14-acre stormwater wetland with floodable park space all around it. But we're making sure to build high paths, high roads, so that connectivity from downtown through the new Kindred community into the Tidewater Drive corridor, and then working with Elizabeth River Trail Foundation down into the Harbor Park Casino District that's undergoing a lot of activity right now, really trying to redevelop the connectivity through that entire part of Norfolk. And so just a few, again, this one's the community part's being constructed now. The Greenway is getting ready to go out to bid later this summer. But we're just envisioning this Greenway extending right up into the urban core, really showcasing big and large and small scale water management techniques in this Kindred community, and enhancing that connectivity. And then as you're moving through this space, driving or walking, just lush green space all around, where currently it's pretty blah in a lot of cases. So been a lot of movement for the community there, but as folks are moving back in, I think they're really enjoying what they're seeing. So we're hoping this will really add to that further. So what's next? What's in the future for Norfolk? So as we continue to think bigger and bigger, we're tackling larger shoreline projects. This is in the Campostella community along one of our historic cemeteries, where we had 13-foot undercut eroding banks and some grave sites that were in dire need of rescue. And so that project's coming to completion now successfully. So those historic cemetery and those grave sites are safe. Just larger scale shorelines. We're thinking about retrofitting Lake Whitehurst, adding wetland cells to add further filtration to even that large reservoir. As we think about our coastal storm risk management project, committed to anywhere possible adding green edges to it. So we know we need to build walls in some areas, but we want to make sure that we add green elements all around those as much as possible. And of course, as we build these sort of isolated wetlands, or even thinking about our natural wetlands deeper up in the headwaters of the city, we know that with sea level rise, they're drowning. So the natural ones are drowning, and the man-made constructed ones that are going to be isolated are drowning. So we're really thinking about working with others on thin layer placement. How can we use dredge material to slowly raise these marshes over time? So you've heard that a few times tonight. It's something the region is really working hard on with our permitters at the state level. With that, not just maintenance, but also monitoring. And Chesapeake Bay Foundation, you might see the little signs outside. They've really started cool monitoring efforts around a lot of our smaller best management practices around the area, really getting citizens involved in monitoring, but at the same time working with our university professors at ODU and Norfolk State and others to get their students involved in long-term monitoring programs, and just continuing to seek input from the community. We know we're making big changes to the city in a lot of ways, and so we want to get feedback on what's working, what's not, so as we continue to work through the city, we can adjust to the maximum extent possible. And then, with that, I'll just say, we're very proud of what Norfolk's doing, but we're certainly not alone in these efforts. There's a lot of good work going on, particularly Virginia Beach, Hampton, similar approaches, different prioritization, different tactics sometimes, but a lot of good work. Our friends at the Planning District Commission, gatherings like this are really important for sharing this sort of information and getting residents, getting staff to share what they're working on, so that again, we can see what's working in different places and then implement these projects as successfully as possible. So with that, I think we're going to take some questions and talk to the panel. So thank you.
Jessica and Joe will have you sit here. Thank you for the questions. We have probably time for several, so feel free to keep submitting through the QR code. Okay, Justin, I think this first question is for you. But if others who have been involved with the Ohio Creek project can weigh in, that's fine. During communication with the Ohio Creek community, were there city residents that displayed negative attitudes towards the efforts either before, during, or after construction? How did you react?
Yeah, I mean, a project of that scale, there's definitely going to be folks who don't agree with the approach, who don't want to see any change just because, you know, they've been in that community a long time and they don't want to have anything affect it. So a lot of work on educating on the risks that they may face, reminding them about historic storms, you know, showing them pictures of the impacts in their community, letting their neighbors remind them. So those are important to really bring the primary goal of the project to the forefront. But beyond that, you have to listen to them, adjust if you're able to, while still moving the project forward. And then really keep that in mind as we're monitoring and maintaining the project, that there are going to be some aspects of it that we really have to focus more and more on. Those bioswales, for instance, have gotten a lot of criticism, and we continue to try to work on them to find a set of a plant palette that they're happy with. So, you know, it's just things as minute as that we have to keep focusing on.
Joe or Jessica, want to add anything? Okay, and this is a little bit similar. For communities that do have concerns about projects or change, how do you measure success of a nature-based solution? Can be specific to this project or just in general, of course.
Yeah, I mean, I think the first thing you always want to do when you do these nature-based solutions is have a goal in mind. Is it to protect to a certain storm? Is it to, you know, prevent a critical infrastructure from flooding? But setting that goal and making sure the community from the get-go knows what that goal is important. You know, I think a lot of times some of these projects go in, I mean, I know from my other organization, sometimes they go in without a goal, and then everyone thinks that they're going to save their house. And, you know, living shorelines don't save your house. They prevent ongoing erosion to the land behind your house because water comes to a level, and if your house happens to be below that level, then you're going to flood, even if you have a living shoreline in your backyard. But I think setting those expectations with the people who are making, like homeowners and or installations that I deal with, is very important so that they know what they're getting before it gets in the ground, and then when something does happen, they feel like they were misled.
And I can say from a university perspective, obviously, we're not the folks who go out and construct these things. But one thing that we have a lot of faculty who are very interested in is how do we monitor and quantify the performance and the benefits for people. So we have a partnership with the Chesapeake Bay Foundation. We have our own ICAR research faculty cohort, in addition to 45 other faculty affiliates throughout ODU and all of our colleges and schools. And we're actually right now, if anybody knows an engineer who's looking for a job, we're looking to backfill our resilient engineering position. And that's one of the things that we're really making investments in, looking at how do we quantify some of these things? Because being able to have that data becomes a really important communication to be able to give to, whether it's the nonprofits or the Navy or the cities, and be able to say, hey, here's this independent assessment from the university that this is what you get and this is what we see. UNC Wilmington, who I used to work with very frequently in North Carolina, has had a really impressive program in monitoring the performance of living shorelines versus the performance of bulkheads for storm damage post Hurricanes Matthew and Florence, and have been able to quantify things for homeowners in particular, like you have a quicker recovery time with a living shoreline than with a bulkhead, and you may have a greater upfront cost to install the living shoreline, but you have a much lower cost to actually repair the shoreline afterward than you do with having to repair a storm surge damage bulk. So those are some of the different kinds of metrics that a university, I think, is interested in being able to contribute.
I'll just add, I think it's important to communicate those goals up front, but also to really work on reiterating them down the road. So, once a project's built, everybody's excited about it, and then it's just sort of there. And it's part of their life, and maybe the maintenance doesn't get kept up quite as well as we would all hope. And so it's important to keep emphasizing the benefit. Maybe you can get some community volunteers to help tidy it up every now and then. You want them to think of it as part of their community and an asset that they want to help maintain and support. So that way, if you can reiterate the benefits periodically through community meetings, civic league events, social media, whatever it might be, it can get lost in the clutter, but you just have to really have a communication plan that emphasizes that touching back on it periodically.
Great, thank you. What are the top 3 things that individuals can do within their homes or yards that can help make a positive impact for these efforts?
I'll say one: plant a tree.
Plant another tree. Is that each 3 or one each?
There are 3 of us.
Yeah.
Oh, okay. So plant a tree, plant another tree. Look for ways to hold stormwater for longer on your property. That doesn't necessarily mean have a big puddle that you have mosquitoes grow in, but taking a look at rain gardens, if that's something that's feasible on your property, rain barrels, those sorts of things. I'm saying that knowing that we've said that we were going to do those things at our house for about 4 years now. It's gotten them done, but it's I think, in addition to adding trees, adding native trees when you can, is controlling that stormwater on your property.
The other one is the talk to your neighbor. I think a lot of times, I know that we talk to each other. We're like, talking to the same people over and over because we all kind of think the same way. I think in my neighborhood, there's a lot of people in my cul-de-sac that do not agree with what I think. And those are the people that we need to get to understand why we're doing these types of projects and why they're important, and not necessarily, talk to the same people over and over. So, and some of them have come around. I've actually, a lot of times I find that people just do not know. I'd see someone like, why are they doing that? Like, because they shouldn't be doing that, or they could do something different. But a lot of people just do not know this information. And so I think it is our job to try to educate and just talk to our neighbors about it, and not force it down their throat, but let them see the product too. Because a lot of times, once they see it, they're like, well, I want to do that. And and a lot of those people are not the people that would typically come to these meetings or, agree with some of the things that we agree with.
And just from a project approach again, I think another one that's often forgotten is not everybody wants to plant a tree or add a rain barrel or plant a rain garden, but everybody has a lawn just about, and it's amazing the difference between a healthy, dethatched, aerated lawn and the ability of that to infiltrate water versus a lawn that's been just mowed and mowed and mowed and mowed without any other attention. And so that's really just more of an educational thing, just getting people thinking about that. And that's something that historically people used to do, but less and less so. And so getting people thinking about that as a practice, again, that we all need to be implementing periodically, at least in our yards.
Great. Have you all considered the fact that maybe some of our communities or portions of our communities will have to move from the coast?
It's certainly something that we think about. And, Norfolk, we looked way out in 2100 with our Vision 2100 plan. And in that, we sort of divided the city up into 4 zones based off elevation. And we knew places like downtown, really our economic core had to be protected at all costs. There's other areas that are on high ground where we perceive them being the future development areas of the city or major redevelopment areas. That's, the military highway, Little Creek Road corridors, for instance. And then there's other areas that are going to be harder to manage. We have projects like the Coastal Storm Risk Management Project that are going to protect us from big storms, but we can't close those gates every day. So we are going to be looking at different techniques to manage other areas, and some will involve intermediate structures, little low berms. Others will involve house raising. And yes, in the future, I think some residents will choose to move out, and if enough residents in a certain area move out and the houses aren't doing well in the market, there may be opportunities then to consider retreat and turning those into open spaces. And I think some of the other cities in the region are really looking at this a little more. Chesapeake has some areas they've trialed this in. So again, different approaches in different cities that are getting experimented with.
I know, speaking about the Navy, the Navy has these installation development plans that are just like master plans that cities have. And they have started to include resilience planning in that. And, I know that like NSA, Hampton Roads, I was sitting in meetings last week or 2 weeks ago where they're like looking at, do we keep, this building only has this lifetime left. It floods. Do we move it to somewhere else? So I think on an installation level, there are certain bases that are doing it. I think the question will be, will this continue into the future? I think it should. The Navy, no matter where you're at, is extremely close to the water. Most of the installations, their stormwater systems are outdated, just like cities. And a lot of the flooding that we experience in Norfolk stations are stormwater-driven flooding because they're undersized and it comes back up through the system. And so that is a major infrastructure overhaul that would need to happen. But one thing you can control is where you place major infrastructure in the future. And some of this infrastructure will have an end-of-lifetime, it reach its end-of-lifetime usefulness within the next, 10 to 20 years, and you just have to make smart decisions on where to put a new building at.
Yeah, so I think coming from North Carolina, I have the somewhat unique experience of having worked with disaster survivor communities. And those are places where when you have flooding, the scale that North Carolina experienced in Floyd in 99, supposedly once in a generation, and then Matthew in 2016, supposedly once in a generation, and then 23 months later in Hurricane Florence, supposedly once in a generation, the discussion gets forced. So there's a lot of lessons learned from other places that have started addressing the issue of relocation. I think in general, the opportunity to think of it proactively is puts your community in a lot better position than having to do it once you've experienced a disaster. The catch then is that you have to be ready to have what are very, very difficult conversations. I don't want to I don't think that I can underscore enough how difficult those conversations are. I was in one of the first public meeting that we had for the Disaster Recovery Action Plan with our HUD funds for Hurricanes Matthew and Florence in Lumberton, North Carolina. And the first person who got up to give a public comment stood up and said, I want you to understand that you are talking about the most personal thing that you could possibly talk about in this meeting, and that's my home. And so going into these conversations, I think they have to be structured very carefully. They have to be structured respectfully. They have to be structured acknowledging that there are real economic challenges in a region that is so dependent on maritime to say, just pick up and move. And it's absolutely critically important to recognize that most people in our region do not have the ability to pick up and leave their home and be able to purchase a comparable home somewhere less at risk. And that is very, very challenging, particularly post-disaster, when somebody's been flooded once, twice, 3 times. It is not safe for them to remain there. But then figuring out how to use funds to get that person to a safer place is very, very hard. So I wanted to just kind of put out there that something that you can do is express your support for having these kind of conversations. It's very, very difficult to get people to buy in to say, hey, let's go have the most awkward day-long workshop of our entire lives and then continue to do it again for a number of years. Because when we look at other places that are trying to do managed relocation, it is a years-long negotiation process. But letting people know, letting your elected officials know that this is important and it needs to happen, I think it's something that is extremely helpful for the staff members who are also in the middle of this, but would be the ones who would be managing it.
Excellent questions still, but I told you all we would wrap up around 7:30, so I want to respect that. Our speakers may be around for a few minutes to answer questions. If not, you can always follow up with me, and I can pose it to the appropriate speaker afterwards on email. If you can join me in giving these speakers a round of applause. I think their presentations and questions are